It is a truth universally acknowledged that the Jane Austen lovers of BookTube must be in want of Jane Austen July. That's right, I am so excited to be hosting the 5th annual Jane Austen July, along with my wonderful co-hosts, Katie from Books and Things and Claudia from Spinster's Library. They are lovely ladies and dear friends of mine, and if you have not subscribed to their channels already, please do go check them out. They make fantastic and really inspired content. If you are new to BookTube or new to my channel, or have not heard about this readathon, let me cordially introduce you to Jane Austen July. Welcome. Jane Austen July is a month-long readathon devoted to celebrating the fabulous Jane Austen. In July, we read books about Jane Austen and focus on learning all about her life, her time period, and her legacy. This readathon is one of my absolute favorite parts of BookTube, and I love seeing all the creative content that channels post surrounding Jane Austen and her works. Each year, there are a group of read-alongs of Jane Austen's works and challenges as well, but of course, as always, the only challenge or requirement needed for full participation in Jane Austen July is to read one of Austen's works. So let me spend the rest of this video taking you through the challenges and giving you some of my personal favorite recommendations for each challenge. You can find all of the challenges, the recommendations, group reading schedules, my co-hosts' announcement videos for this year, and plenty of previous Jane Austen content linked in the description down below. So please do take the time to peruse that section if you are eager to get a head start on Jane Austen July. And maybe grab yourself a cup of tea, perhaps in a Jane Austen mug, and join me for the challenges and recommendations. So the first challenge is to read one of Jane Austen's 6 novels. That would be Pride and Prejudice, Sense and Sensibility, Mansfield Park, Persuasion, Emma, and Northanger Abbey. And if you're having trouble deciding, we are doing a group read-along of possibly my favorite Jane Austen novel of all time, or at least the one that I've read the most, and that is Pride and Prejudice. We'll be reading Pride and Prejudice from July 1st through the 15th. And the schedule, like I said, is listed below. I think that Pride and Prejudice is a really wonderful place to start if you are new to Austen's work, or if you've been intimidated by her in the past and would like to give her another try. Pride and Prejudice is the story of Mr. and Mrs. Bennet's 5 unmarried daughters as they navigate the Regency Era marriage market. With no sons in the family, the Bennet daughters feel immense pressure to marry, and marry well, in order to achieve long-term financial security for themselves and their sisters. At the beginning of the book, the wealthy and eligible Mr. Bingley moves in next door and takes an immediate interest in the eldest daughter, Jane. Mrs. Bennet cannot be more thrilled, but Bingley's status-conscious friend, Mr. Darcy, is disdainful of the Bennet society and continuously clashes with the second oldest daughter, Elizabeth Bennet. This is such a fun book that looks at marriage and class and family in really interesting ways and features some of Austen's best and most beloved characters. The second challenge is to read something by Jane Austen that is not one of her main 6 novels. So for this, you can read Jane Austen's unfinished novels, The Watsons or Sanditon, or some of her juvenilia, or perhaps a nice bind-up of her letters. Or you could join us for the second group read-along running from July 18th through the 24th and read Lady Susan, Jane Austen's novella. Lady Susan is an epistolary novella, so it's written as a series of letters, and it's about the beautiful, flirtatious, and recently widowed Lady Susan Vernon, who tries to secure a favorable second marriage for herself while trying to force her poor daughter into a far less desirable match. Lady Susan is a shockingly different heroine than we are used to seeing from Jane Austen. She's older, but she's also manipulative, ruthless, and conniving. She's horrible and absolutely hilarious and delightful to read about. So if you're looking for something a little different from Austen, perhaps you would like to join us for this read-along. The third challenge is to read a nonfiction work about Jane Austen or her time period, which is the Late Georgian or Regency Era. There are plenty of books about this time and even about Jane Austen herself. There's literary criticism about her work, memoirs about how her work has impacted and affected others, or you might consider reading one of the many Austen biographies out there. Some of my favorite nonfiction books that I've read about Jane Austen and her time period include Jane Austen at Home by Lucy Worsley, which is a biography of Austen that looks at the places that she lived and uses that to analyze her life. Lucy Worsley is one of my favorite nonfiction authors, and this book is absolutely wonderful for Austen fans. Another biography that I'd love to recommend is The Real Austen, A Life in Small Things by Paula Byrne. This biography of Austen looks at small things that affected Austen's life and uses those objects as a springing off point to discuss her life. So things like topaz crosses, her writing desk, her notebooks, an Indian shawl. This book is brilliantly done, very well researched, and I highly recommend it. If you're looking for less of a biography and more information about the time period, you might choose to read Jane Austen's England by Roy and Leslie Adkins, Daily Life in the Georgian and Regency periods. And it discusses, as this cover suggests, daily life in the Georgian and Regency time period. It touches on Jane Austen's life here and there and really connects daily life in England to things Jane Austen might have experienced. It gives a great background to the war and unrest and dramatic changes that were happening in England at the time that are in the background of Austen's work. Perhaps my favorite nonfiction book about Jane Austen's works themselves is this delightful piece of literary criticism, and that is What Matters in Jane Austen, 20 Crucial Puzzles Solved by John Mullen. John Mullen is an eminent Austen scholar, and this book is absolutely brilliant. It discusses themes like age, death, the seaside, characters blushing, and so much more in a really interesting and detailed way. I would warn you though, if you plan on reading this book, I recommend having read all of Jane Austen's main 6 novels and perhaps her unfinished works as well, but at least the main 6 novels because there are spoilers for those in this book. I have 2 more nonfiction recommendations about Jane Austen's time period and then we'll move on, I promise. This is a brilliant book, Elegant Etiquette in the 19th Century by Mallory James. This is a very detailed guide to the manners and etiquette of the 19th century. It's great to understand the nuances in Austen's work and also work from later in the century, encompassing the Victorian era. But the Regency wasn't all about good manners. The other recommendation I have for you is An Elegant Madness, High Society in Regency England by Venetia Murray. This book discusses the seedy underbelly of high society, characters like Brummel and Byron, and all of the notorious gossip that was present during the Regency era. The fourth challenge is to read a modern retelling of a Jane Austen book or a historical fiction book set during the Georgian or Regency era. One of my favorites for this is Longbourn by Jo Baker. This is Pride and Prejudice, but told from the servant's point of view. If you read Pride and Prejudice, it's easy to forget that the servants are there in the background, following the story along with the reader. This book really brings that to light in interesting ways. I also highly recommend The Other Bennet Sister by Janice Hadlow. This book made me feel like I was reading an Austen novel again for the first time. It's the untold story of Mary Bennet, the slightly forgotten sister in Pride and Prejudice. I did a whole review on this book if you're interested, but I do highly recommend it. It is absolutely brilliant. Another book that I highly recommend is Miss Austen by Jill Hornby. This book is all about Cassandra Austen, Jane's sister, who she was very, very close with. Cassandra was Jane's best friend and confidant, and this book imagines what life was like for Cassandra before Jane passed away and after. It's a really beautifully, subtly done book that has so much reverence for Jane Austen and her works. I believe that Jill Hornby is also coming out with a new book called Godmersham Park that's all about Anne Sharp, a governess who was friendly with Jane Austen's family. That book will be out in time in the UK for Jane Austen July, but not in the US, so I personally won't be able to obtain a copy until probably closer to when it comes out in November. But for those of you who are in the UK, I hope you get to enjoy Godmersham Park and tell me all about it. There are so many more modern retellings and historical fiction books all about Jane Austen and her time period. I could make a whole video on that, and perhaps one day I will, but for now I will just list a whole bunch more in the description box below, so do take advantage of that. The fifth challenge is to read something by a contemporary author of Jane Austen, someone who was publishing in her lifetime, give or take a few years, or someone who may have even inspired her own writing. Possible authors that I'm aware of, there's Sir Walter Scott, Fanny Burney, Maria Edgeworth, Susan Edmonston Ferrier, Charlotte Lennox. There are, of course, the Romantic poets, Coleridge, Blake, Byron, Wordsworth, Shelley, Keats. Or if you are very interested in poetry, you could read one of Austen's favorite poets, Cowper, which is spelled like Cowper, C-O-W-P-E-R. And if you need even more inspiration, I have a Goodreads list that I found years ago that is titled What Jane Austen Read, which has many of these authors and other contemporaries of Jane Austen on that list. Feel free to peruse it for yourselves. I can't take credit for it, somebody else made it, but it's a wonderful place to start if you are interested in the contemporary authors of Jane Austen's time. The last two challenges are all about screen adaptations of Jane Austen. Challenge number 6 is to watch a direct screen adaptation of an Austen book. And I have so many that I'm excited about and that I love. But first of all, I would be remiss not to mention the brand new adaptation of Persuasion that is coming to Netflix in the middle of July. I am so excited to watch this one, and I am sure I will talk about it more in my TBR, or in this case, to be watched, not read. There are so many direct Austen adaptations, but I will just name a few of my favorites here. My absolute favorite, or a classic that I can always turn to, is the 1995 BBC miniseries of Pride and Prejudice with Colin Firth. Seriously, who doesn't love that one? There's also the 2005 version of Pride and Prejudice with Keira Knightley, which I like in a very different way. It's a lot more condensed, of course. And then I'm quite partial to J.J. Field as an actor, and he stars as Henry Tilney in the 1997 Northanger Abbey, which I love to watch from time to time. Emma adaptations are probably my favorites because there's just something about Emma that lends itself to being adapted. My favorite Emma adaptation has to be the 2009 BBC version. The new 2020 version of Emma is really aesthetically beautiful, but not how I imagine Emma as a character, though plenty of people disagree with me, so if you haven't watched it, I do recommend that version. I'll list more direct adaptations that I love in the description below, so take a look. And the last challenge, the 7th challenge, is to watch a modern screen adaptation of a Jane Austen book. For this, my personal favorite will always be Clueless. Alicia Silverstone's Cher Horowitz just really captures the essence of Jane Austen's character, Emma. She's meddlesome and privileged, but also really endearing, and this movie just makes a lot of really smart choices. There's Bridget Jones's Diary, which is good fun, and Pride and Prejudice, which is a lot of fun as well. I love all of the Bollywood dances. And of course, there's Austenland, which is an amazing movie, though not exactly an adaptation of any one particular Austen book. I think that it plays with rom-com conventions in really interesting ways, and J.J. Field is in it as well, and he is wonderful. So that is all I have for you guys today. In the interest of time, I didn't recommend every book and TV show and movie that I could think of. I will make a more comprehensive list down below in the description, so please do check that out. And even that won't be comprehensive. There are just so many wonderful Jane Austen related books and content out there. So do explore and enjoy. I would love to hear from you in the comments down below about everything and anything Jane Austen related. Do you think that you'll participate in Jane Austen July this year? I don't care if it's your first time, your fifth time, we are so happy to have you. Do you think you'll participate in the read-alongs with us? Because I would love to discuss Pride and Prejudice and Lady Susan with you. And what do you think you'll be reading? I can't wait to share my TBR with you in a later video. So until next time, I look forward to seeing you in another Jane Austen July related video very soon. Bye!